consideration of how we reach the point where we have a lot of problems with reservoirs. And in trying to understand that, you can really go back to the early days of Kansas. And you had a lot of people coming here in the mid-1800s and coming for the deep, rich soils and agricultural bounty that was anticipated. But when they arrived, it was a very different environment from what they were experiencing back east, where there were lots of natural lakes and basins with water. But out here, they were experiencing moving waters. Not a lot of basins. There aren't a lot of natural lakes in Kansas. And most of the water is in rivers and streams and flowing. So there's a lot of water at various points in time. In fact, sometimes too much water. But at other times, there isn't enough at all. And if most of the water is in streams and rivers, it became very obvious to people quickly that they needed to build dams and hold on to some of this water. And that's what they did. So we built reservoirs where they are very prone to soil erosion. So you have water quality problems and you have storage problems. For example, our storage problems, our largest reservoirs in Kansas are the 24 federal reservoirs. And they have 3 times more volume than all of the other reservoirs combined, the 24 federal reservoirs. And over the next 10 years, it is projected that 2 of those 24 will have become 50% filled with sediment.
The water that we've had over the last couple, 3 years that got low was due to the drought situation or lack of rain. And when that happened, people started asking questions on what's going on out there. I'm seeing all the land and we're losing water. What's going to happen? And then that's when we talked about, well, that's not the lowest that it's been in the record, but definitely stuff's going on, and really, you know, until Mother Nature helps us, we're not going to be able to do a lot. The town of Burlington they got to a point where when they get up to like 1 million gallons of treated water, there's various warnings that go in, and if there's drought things that happen. But I just recall this, they were up near 1 million gallons they were treating a day. And when they got to that point, they issued notices, we need to do something. And, you know, came out in the newspaper and people responded.
I grew up in East Central Kansas, and as being part of East Central Kansas, relying on surface water as part of our drinking water and our means of living in Kansas, we always knew that it might be something we would have to conserve during what times of the year. We knew that there was water that was available and we could use it for washing our cars, watering the yard. But when we get to the dry months of the year, having man-made lakes that had limited storage capacity, that we would have to conserve water.
By the time a reservoir becomes 50% filled with sediment or lost half of its volume, it is really fairly severely impacted. And it is really not providing the resources it was once intended to provide when it was constructed and a big investment was made to construct it. 50% filled is really a juncture point for a reservoir where now it's really holding a lot less storage, and if there's any kind of a drought, it just won't be able to hold enough to overcome that drought, and people will run out of water.
The water is used for drinking water because when it's released, you've got the town of Burlington, you've got the town of Chanute, Iola, and all the way down through the basin down below that's actually pulling water out of the river once it's released, and they're treating that water for drinking water. And that's one thing that probably a lot of people don't understand when they turn their tap on at home or they go wash their, bathe or wash their clothes. It's because of having access to that water.
The estimates that we receive on the flood damage prevention from John Redmond comes from the Army Corps, and they do that annually. And in 2013, the estimated prevention amount was $8.5 million.
As far as the operation of the reservoir, it still provides for flood risk management as it is, even with the sedimentation there. We're still able, as an agency, to provide flood risk management there within the reservoir as well as for downstream.
Looking at some of these water quality problems, we certainly experience, and people are getting more and more used to, large outgrowths of algae and cyanobacteria, which is another type of photosynthetic microscopic plant. And we get large outgrowths of them, blooms of them. Sometimes reservoirs are shut down because there's too much algae in the water. Invariably, the water becomes more expensive to treat, and it can develop taste and odor problems to treat for drinking water. And 20 of our federal reservoirs are used fairly consistently for drinking water. And Kansans are supplied, 60% of Kansans receive drinking water from reservoirs.
John Redmond Reservoir is a great tourism attraction for Coffee County. Pulls in people from all over the state to do fishing and wildlife watching. It pulls in about $300,000 within a 30-mile radius annually.
I watched two bald eagles one day chase down a snow goose out of the air, knock this goose out of the air, and basically feast upon it or have lunch. And that was an awesome sight. I'd never seen it done before, and to see that two bald eagles work as a team and to knock this snow goose out of the air was awesome.
We have a few endangered species in the Neosho River. Includes the Neosho mad tom, which is basically kind of looks like a miniature catfish. He's got whiskers and basically looks just like a catfish, but he's not. And then there's the Neosho mucket, which is a freshwater mussel. Both of those are endangered species and of concern in the Neosho.
Water is essential to the production of energy everywhere, and particularly in Kansas. In Kansas, about 8% of the water that's used is for industrial use. About half of that's for energy production. And here at Wolf Creek and at all our power plants, we use water to help the process where we convert water to steam. That drives our turbines. That induces an electric current. That's what makes everybody's power. And then we have to cool that steam back down so it can be reheated and produce more power. John Redmond Reservoir is critical to Wolf Creek. That's why we sited here, because when we were looking around for a place to put this nuclear power plant back in the 70s, we looked all over the state for places that had available water, and John Redmond had that. So we sited this here because it was within a short distance from Redmond and the Neosho River where we would pump that water. So having that available water was critical to siting Wolf Creek here. John Redmond Reservoir, like all reservoirs, are sedimenting in. John Redmond's setting in at a faster rate than most. And so it's drawn everybody's attention to evaluate how do we preserve that as a good water source, not only for Wolf Creek, but also for all the users downstream, Burlington and Iola and Parsons. They're all depending on that also. So we've been trying to figure out what the best way is to maintain the viability of that reservoir for water supply. So the Water Office has been working really diligently with the Corps of Engineers to first raise the conservation pool level, which they've successfully done this past year at John Redmond. So they've increased the available supply. They've also managed to work out an agreement where the Corps, to their credit, is being a little bit creative in maintaining water even above their conservation pool in case things do get dry for an extended period of time. They start out with more water to begin with. So creative things are being done.
We can slow down sedimentation with various means, but we can't stop it. So we are going to have to slow it down even more. We're going to have to continually remove sediment from reservoirs. or bypass sediment around reservoirs, and that's very expensive. And the example is by dredging, which is sucking sediment out of the bottom of a reservoir and transporting it someplace, cost at today's price $6 for a cubic yard. To take 1 cubic yard of sediment out of a reservoir, it costs $6. And by the end of this century, we will have, it's projected we will have accumulated 2.3 billion cubic yards of sediment in our reservoirs, in the 24 federal reservoirs. We will have accumulated 2.3 billion cubic yards. And if we are to restore at the end of this century the storage capacity that we originally constructed at $6 a cubic yard, it'll cost $13.8 billion.
So when we look at our short-term and long-term plans for water supply here at Wolf Creek, short-term, we're really in pretty good shape. The pool level in Redmond's been raised. Our projections are that things should be stable through the mid-20s, so we have about 10 years to go. Meanwhile, though, we know that it will continue to silt in. So one of the practices that we're looking at right now is doing some dredging over there, basically scooping out some of that sediment that's filled that reservoir in. Now that's not a great long-term plan. We don't feel because it's expensive. We think that's a tool that we use in the next 15 and 20 years maybe.
Is a perfect moment for all of us to recognize even more and to focus even more on conserving water. That's really the best thing we can do.
Growing up, we had a small man-made lake, and we knew that it was a limited resource unless we was blessed with rain all the time. And when you grow up that way, knowing that it's a limited resource, it always stays in the back of your mind as you grow up. I told the story to my kids about how water can be a precious commodity. And when John Redmond Reservoir got low, I made sure to drive them across the top of the lake and say, take a look at this. Remember how it was under normal conditions compared to what it is now.
We're going to have to assess each reservoir in terms of, is it worth fixing? Is there some other alternate water source that could be used instead of that reservoir? In other words, is there another large federal reservoir nearby? For example, the John Redmond Reservoir, which is the one coming up the soonest, only in a couple of years to be 50% infilled. Just to the north, 10 or 15 miles, is Melbourne Reservoir, which is much less impacted, has considerably more volume of water in it, and maybe a thought could be given to water from Melbourne Reservoir providing what Redmond cannot provide because John Redmond is too large a financial investment. Maybe it isn't too large an investment now. Maybe it's a good idea to dredge it now. But we are going to be in a position in the future where we will have a number of reservoirs at the same time to make these judgments about.
I think when you live in a community like this, you don't always realize what you have and embrace it, so to speak. I've lived here 17 years and I've been to the museum once, and that's on me. So, that's just part of being in the community. You don't always realize what's there.
Reservoirs are infrastructure. They're really infrastructure for our society. It's something we built. They didn't come there naturally. We needed them. Many were built for good reasons. It's something we built. Just like roads, just like buildings, just like automobiles or vehicles.
Those are things that people use for livelihood, stress relievers coming out there, whether they're bird watching, hiking, riding ATVs, riding horseback riding. But when you lose that stuff, there's not quite as much fun anymore when there's not water.
I believe when we first started building so many reservoirs, certainly beginning in the 1800s, but increasing and ever since the 1920s, society just believed they were building lakes. And lakes don't need to be cared for on a continuing basis. And people were coming from parts of the country that had mostly lakes, and people weren't managing those lakes in the 1800s or early 1900s. So we built reservoirs initially without the expectation of having to do much with them, without really recognizing they were infrastructure just like a building.
You know, we have to have a leap of faith when we use surface water, especially something like John Redmond Reservoir, that, you know, that God is going to fill it back up for us, but we got to have that faith that it's always going to occur.